Hello, and welcome to this 11th
Wow.
episode of What Sex Got to Do with It. And I'm here with my favorite 84-year-old great grandmother, my most favorite in all the Northern Hemisphere. So, Heather Remmel.
Oh, you are excessive, if nothing else.
Oh, and we're just going to get even more so. And so this chapter 10 is called Designing Women. And if you watch the last chapter, the last episode of chapter 9, you know that we got out of it and we kind of rushed out of it. But we're continuing on. We're talking about women. And I think this Designing Women kind of fits right into it. And the source's title?
The source's title, I'm not much into popular culture, but wasn't there once a TV show called Designing Women? I think that's probably how that phrase got into my mind.
Yeah.
But the reason I titled the chapter that way is that I really think that once sexual reproduction evolved, and it is driven by female choice, and the choices that women make in terms of the men that they have children with actually design the future generation. So they're selecting genes that are going to make it into the next generation. I know Alfred Russel Wallace, one of his problems with, toward the end of his life, he sort of decided that, evolution is not quite as accurate as it ought to be. You know, how can it possibly explain this wonderful species that is human? But in fact, he rejected Darwin's theory of sexual selection, and he should have, because Darwin's theory of sexual selection just was based on selecting for beauty, which is insufficient to select for all the other traits that make us so wonderfully human. So, but in fact, what Alfred Russel Wallace proposed, if he had understood sexual selection in the way that we're trying to explain it here, female choice actually can explain so many of the traits that Alfred Russel Wallace felt Darwin insufficiently explained, the evolution of those traits. And it is because of our ability, the language, we can think about what we want for the future. We can look at potential partners that have traits that we would like to see in our children. And so in a sense, we are designing the species of the future. And I think I say in that chapter, if we get it wrong, natural selection will eliminate the product. You know, the child won't thrive. But in a sense, when women are picking their partners, they are shaping the traits of the next generation of humans, is what they are doing.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent you say that, but then to a certain extent it kind of maybe indicates that maybe they have gotten it wrong, and because of the language, and and the ability to acquire assets, you can propagate the wrong selection, and so. But picking up on where you were, I'm going to quote something from early on in that chapter. You say, our initial human reproduction innovations made it possible for females to engage in a trial and error exercise in intelligent design.
Mm-hmm.
They suddenly had real power to choose their sexual partners, and unlike chimps, weren't most often impregnated by a male whose predominant skill was simply bullying his way through the crowd of other males and their competing sperm. Mm-hmm. So my question isn't displaying wealth and power a way of bullying oneself to the top?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm speaking through the mask and not speaking very clearly. Isn't displaying wealth and power a way of bullying oneself to the top?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And as I think I make clear as the book goes on, that a trait that was once adaptive, and that's women selecting for things like wealth and power, and language skills, things that were initially adaptive as we've evolved over these hundreds of thousands of years, have become maladaptive, because by selecting, all species, and there's a wonderful book called A Taste for the Beautiful by Michael J. Ryan, and from that book I got the idea of all species seem drawn to this concept of more, like a bigger voice, a bigger tail, a more flamboyant this. But in other species, because they don't define more symbolically,
Right.
it doesn't get them into trouble. But our obsession with more has meant more consumption, more destruction of the environment. So a trait that initially we needed, in other words, I think we were born, our initial mutation resulted in a species that was not very well adapted to its environment. It hadn't evolved through millions of years of careful, via natural selection, adaptation to the environment. So we were born not particularly well adapted to our environment. And by females selecting for males who were good at building shelter or providing clothing or inventing devices that would protect us from the elements, that was very necessary in the beginning. But carried to extremes, look at what we have done to the planet in just in the 151 now years since Darwin wrote The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex. I mean, our behavior's out of control. It's like we have infinite desires, but we're operating with a finite planet. And so a trait that was very adaptive in the beginning, we needed to select for technological skills. We needed to select for someone who could do all these things, and language made it so possible. So much, just shared skills. All language facilitates all of that. But we're now at a point where that kind of excessive consumption has really gotten us into trouble.
So I may have asked a related question earlier. Do women prefer men that have wealth or men that have power?
I think the two are so closely related that
But
it's
if
hard.
they had to pick one,
There again, that would probably vary with the individual woman, but I find it very difficult to tease wealth and power apart, Len.
yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, but
think,
if they had to pick one,
boy, power expresses itself in different ways. If you're asking this particular woman, I'm more drawn to power. Wealth.
And how do you find power?
An ability. Well, for me, I mean, there's negative power and positive power.
Positive power.
But positive power would be an ability to sort of control, protect you from harms, to help make the world a better place, to have the ability to influence other people in a positive way. That's positive power. But negative power is, power is.
So do you find that generally people who have positive power tend to have more modest personalities? Or do they tend to be ostentatious?
Boy, I think that varies so much.
I know it's biology's variation, but so we're talking generalities here, So do you find that the positive power people tend to be a little more modest? Not a little more, tend to be noticeably modest,
I don't think so, Len.
Interesting.
I mean, many sessions back, you asked me something about whether women were kind of sort of attracted to the bad boys at the top of the pile. And I've been thinking about that. And some of that testosterone-fueled chest beating on the top of the heap, that is very appealing to women.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily a terrific trait, but it is, it's very appealing to women.
Right.
And so just women can then learn, wait a minute, that's not somebody I really want in my life permanently. But initially that can be very appealing.
Right.
So I do think, when you ask me that question, I sort of went, no, I don't think. But yeah, I do. Yeah, there's that ladies love outlaws thing. So not all power is, power can be attractive even when it's not necessarily used for good.
Right. Okay. Because I was just really trying to get at whether or not women could start looking more for actively looking for the good traits by not allowing themselves to be enraptured by the bad traits. I mean, so where I was leading you, and you didn't go there, and that's good. Was that maybe those who have good power tend to be more modest, and so I was wondering, is it likely that women be attracted to the more modest guys, and with those you find some of the traits that don't lead to the accumulation of wealth. Because it's not wealth inherently, it's just the accumulation of too much of it, right? That ends up denying people what they need to live, and so that's what you want to avoid.
Yeah.
But
I want to avoid the great inequalities that exist in human populations. As I've mentioned, I think other places in the book, other species have a much more equitable distribution of resources because it's based on their physical size. It's not based on the symbolic ability to control more than you could ever possibly use in your life. So, I really would like to see a more equitable distribution of resources, and I'd like to see less excessive consumption of the environment. I just, and yet, I think it's in there. We're trying to rise above some of the genetically programmed traits that get humans in trouble in a way that they don't get. Those traits, I think, are in all species, but it gets humans in trouble in a way that it doesn't get other species in trouble in terms of destruction of the environment and in terms of the inequality. We seem to do everything to excess, Len, as humans. And I sound like I hate my own species. I don't.
Right.
But I do want it to change for the better. I'm very, very troubled by gross inequality of wealth. That is appalling to me. And women do select for many wonderful traits in men. Maybe it's in this chapter, maybe in another, that if we're going to solve our problems, we have to, I've focused on the selection for money and power, but in fact, that's but a small portion of the things that women select for. They select for intelligence, they select for kindness. Very high ranking was what I called control of social resources. One of the things I coded for was control of material resources. Control of social resources makes men very, very attractive. And those are men who are cooperative with other men, who are friends, friendship networks. Generosity was a trait that's very appealing to women. If a woman has children, the trait that makes a man most attractive to her is his kindness to her existing children. So, we have to use those cooperative traits that are also very, very attractive to women. And we have to learn to use those traits to counter our tendencies toward tribalism and greed. Those traits are in there. They've been selected for. They're valuable, very valuable, I think, to both men and women. And we have to stop being quite so dazzled by the large amounts of wealth that some people control, that we assume that they're the smartest people. They're not. They're not. Darwin made that mistake. I think it's in this chapter.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a question you wanted to ask me later. But he was very concerned that our species was going to retrograde, in his words, that we were somehow doing it wrong. Because in his words, the most successful members of the species were having the fewest children. But as you and I had discussed earlier, that's adaptive for humans, because once you have good reliable control of resources, you don't need a lot of children in order to get your genes into the gene pool of the next generation. And of course, where Darwin made his mistake, he was concerned that wealthy women, wealthy English women were not having enough children, and he wanted to change that. He was very concerned that in his words, the squalid Irish were having way too many children. And as one of the lines in my book that I like is that, let's see if I can remember it. I'm not good at quoting myself. Confusing wealth with genetic superiority is a mistake made most often by those with great fortunes.
Right.
And Darwin was in that category as part of the landed gentry. But he was very concerned that wealthy English women were not having enough children, or the solid Scots were not having enough children, and the Irish were out competing them all. So that again, that's the Malthusian flaw in his own theory that caused him to distort that. Once everybody has reliable control of resources, population rates will drop.
I understand, and that's even the case in developed countries, right?
Oh, yeah, especially in developed countries. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are exceptions to that. I mean, there are religious exceptions.
Right.
Someone with a harem has with lots of money and lots of wives.
Yeah.
That person has lots of children. So there, as with all things, there are no absolutes, but there are general tendencies.
Right, and I guess what I was thinking is like modern developed countries, where I'm thinking that normally, because I've been doing some stats analysis, on using birth rate, and it was actually the data set is the number of children surviving to age 5 and the number of children that a woman has, and so it used to be that there are fewer children that survive to age 5, the more children they would have. And so now I think in most developed countries, even women who are poor, their children still live to age 5 for the most part.
And their birth rates go down once that's possible. That's absolutely true. They don't, in fact, there reaches a point when there's lower childhood mortality, where poor people have fewer children because children are suddenly very expensive.
Right.
And so, yes, we do make those kind of adaptations.
Right.
Exactly.
So what do you think Darwin would say then, if he was pulled into about that? What his concern then about? So let's say now, the Irish, instead of having lots of kids, now because let's say unfortunately they're not making they're still relatively destitute, or not having fewer kids. What would be his take then?
Well, I think he's so hung up on his own Malthusian flaw that he'd have a hard time processing all that. I think he would have a hard time giving up on his own theory that the most successful people are always going to have the most children.
Right.
That was his theory, and that's why he was troubled. He felt that, we're going to retrograde unless we change the way we're doing. He was very concerned by the drop in population rates. I think he wouldn't be concerned if poor people had fewer children, because he had a bias against the poor and the Irish. He just did.
Right.
So his own theory was influenced by a bias that Thomas Malthus, the English cleric, who was against feeding the poor because it meant that they would have more children.
Yeah.
And Thomas Malthus was not even an amateur naturalist.
Yeah.
And yet he influenced the theory of natural selection in a major way. That just staggers me, Len, and why people haven't recognized that is all I can do. Go back to my new idea, anchor bias.
Yeah.
We have Darwinian understanding that most success is most children, and we just can't get rid of that.
Right. So it was. I found it really curious in a positive way. When you mentioned Henry George, his book Progress and Poverty, and his idea was to eliminate all taxes except those imposed on land values, and how he defines, and how ultimately what you feel is that it's not simply land as in real estate, but land as in a resource, and so I know you're going to talk about that more later, but it was just interesting even back then to see one being very concerned about the growing income inequality, which by our standards today was nothing.
Nothing. And it's interesting too that Alfred Russel Wallace read Progress and Poverty and recommended it to Charles Darwin. He recommended that he read the book, and Darwin's response was, I read a a book by an economist once, and I couldn't make any sense of it. So I don't think he ever actually read Progress and Poverty, but those men were contemporaries. And Alfred Russel Wallace was very concerned with land reform. And of course, when Henry George wrote about land, he was careful in his book to point out he didn't just mean the ground under our feet. He meant what we now call the commons in nature, all naturally occurring resources. But back then, agricultural land, was the most obvious economic feature. And so people have tended to focus on his single tax, which was a tax on land, but today would be a tax on all naturally occurring resources, or not even a tax, what I would rather call a resource rent, or or collecting the economic rental value of the monopoly control of naturally occurring resources.
And maybe I should save this question for last, or later on, but I have it in front of my face now. So I know you've expressed a lot of concern about the direction of the species with respect to what's happening to the planet. Do you think the human species is going to get snuffed out, or do you think we're just going to go through a severe bottleneck?
Oh, Len, I don't know, but I think unless we really figure a way to turn the climate damage that we're causing around, there's going to be a tremendous amount of human suffering. There already is. I mean, fires, floods. There's talk of the thawing tundra releasing all kinds of viruses and bacteria that we haven't really evolved to respond to. I hate to be such a Debbie Downer, but I don't think to call it a climate apocalypse is an exaggeration. And I really worry about the amount of human suffering. Not only that, I really worry about the elimination of other species on this planet. And that's happening now, and happening really fast. And we have so long considered ourselves separate from nature. And I think we need to begin to see ourselves as a part of everything. That you talked about how we are shaped by nature, we are, part of the natural world. I think we really have to understand that at the deepest level, that this life on this planet is one interconnected, finely evolved and finely tuned interdependence between all the species. And we've treated ourselves as if we're somehow above that. And that hubris, unless we can turn it around and care as much about members of our own species, other members of our own species, and other species, we're writing a script that's going to have a very sad ending. Whether humans will survive some bottleneck in which many of us perish, I don't know. But unless we change our behavior, I think those who are left, unless we recognize that some of our species-specific behavior is treating the planet like a disposable resource, and it's not. And unless we learn how to live sustainably with the rest of the world, I don't see a happy ending for that, Len. Len, I hate to be so glum, but I believe in the power of changing minds. I wouldn't have written the book if I weren't hoping to have an impact and change.
And now I'm realizing I shouldn't have asked that question now, because there's another question I want to ask that's really more relevant to this one. So I'm going to ask you, because you have about 3.5 minutes left. I may want to have another question. So you talk about how one of the issues, with trying to control reproduction was women not wanting to be visible. You say, sexually speaking, we don't necessarily want a man to notice us, at least not at first, not before we determine whether or not we're in the market for the kind of attention he might be selling. However, that may well work for us reproductively, it works against us when this talent for ignoring women is carried over into the classroom, etc. So are you saying that the sexism that resulted is an unintended consequence of women wanting to be ignored at some point?
Well, women don't want to be ignored, but biologically
Yeah.
we're designed,
Right.
and it's been very effective for us. Reproductively, it's been effective for us. In terms of living out our dreams in economically and culturally, it hasn't worked so well for us, but reproductively, by flying beneath the radar, by not having this flamboyant estrus that every other single mammal has. I mean, isn't that astonishing how exceptional we are in that regard? By flying beneath the radar, we get to evaluate men carefully in a way that a female chimp does not. And that works very well for us. But it means that we're content to not be noticed. When I say content, this is not a logical, rational thing. It's just how the behavior is worked out. But that means that women do get ignored.
Right.
And by other women as well. You know, it's easier to hear a male voice, to believe what a male voice is saying, than it is to hear a very high female voice. We're learning to be different. I just love the fact that, like the talking, like the newscasters and stuff on TV, we now have more female voices. So we're all learning. Look how smart women are. You know, they can't just be dismissed. But this ability of women to fly beneath the radar has not served us well in terms of having our ideas heard. Look at all the female scientists that have been ignored over the years. I keep a file of them. The ones who made great discoveries that nobody heard about until after they died. That's horrifying.
Yeah. So it's just kind of interesting how in a sense it's connected to reproduction, you know, and somehow we can't really control the consequences of it, you know, but
we're learning.
We're
learning, and we need to.
Right.
If we want the humans of the future to enjoy the happy, comfortable lives that you and I mean, we are so privileged, Len, let's face it. In terms of comparing ourselves to the rest of the world, we have such easy, privileged lives.
Yeah.
I would like all humans to have those lives.
Yes, and it's almost as if it's so easy that we're painting by numbers, which is the title of chapter 11, which we will do next time.
Okay. Excellent. Well done.